is a really interesting one because he went from being a flexible pick between assassin and tank to pretty much being only playable as a tank for a while, and at the same time he was being picked pretty much every game because of how overpowered tank EKKO was, and so Riot targeted him with a bunch of nerfs over the last few patches to tone down tank EKKO specifically and try to introduce carry EKKO back into the meta. It's hard to say if he's in the best spot or not right now, but he can definitely be played in both styles still. So we're going to break down the different options, and please keep in mind that this is more of like a meta-analysis of EKKO's role in the meta, and it's not really going to be a guide for learning how to play him, but hopefully you guys still find it useful, and who knows, maybe you'll still learn something at the end of the video. This is a new idea that we've had for a while, so please let us know what you think about it, or maybe what we can improve on in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit that like button, and if you don't, please hit that dislike. We're actually going to be talking about 3 EKKO playstyles in this video, and those are Tank EKKO up in the top lane, Assassin or Carry EKKO up in the mid lane, and AP Bruiser EKKO in the jungle. Tank EKKO is probably the most familiar style because it's been the most powerful for the last couple of months or so, and the tank build became a must pick or ban in ranked, as well as seeing play in the majority of competitive games, so we're going to start with that. The general runes for it are going to be Magic Penetration Reds to get maximum benefit from his early power, Armor Yellows, and Magic Resistance Blues for tankiness, along with some Ability Power Quints to punch through with a little bit more damage and help with wave clearing. These are pretty standard EKKO runes for almost all roles, but things really changed the masteries. You're going to want to go 12-0-18, which is the standard mastery page for Tank EKKO, because of the crazy sustain that Grasp of the Undying gives, and EKKO can pretty much trigger it whenever he wants using his E. For a while at the start of the season, the meta really favored tanks, and it still kind of does, and especially defensive items overall, and EKKO was one of the picks that really took advantage of it, because of his amazing mobility and base damage, and especially his utility as well. Tank items are always going to be a good idea to pick up because they're just far cheaper to build than damage items, meaning you can get a defensive item going way before you would reach a power spike through offensive items. Pre-nerf EKKO had these crazy high base damages that allowed him to do pretty much everything well, but now things are a little bit more balanced. However, EKKO's Q is still a fantastic poke and wave clearing tool, and it allows him to zone people away from CS and build up big advantages from early on. Usually this would have drawbacks because you'd be pushing to the enemy side of the map, but EKKO's mobility means that he can harass and back out before the enemy jungler can even start heading up top to help. There's 2 big perks to playing Tank EKKO. The first is pretty simple. Because you're itemizing for defense items, you don't really have to worry so much about getting caught or punished for making mistakes. That added survivability makes it way easier to play, honestly, making it both ideal for new EKKO players, but also making it really scary for those with a lot of practice on EKKO. The other major benefit to Tank EKKO is that cheap defensive items means you aren't particularly dependent on having a high gold income. You can dedicate a bunch of time to things that don't really get you gold, maybe roaming mid, teleporting to bot lane, getting your team ahead, but maybe not yourself, and still end up even on item numbers as an enemy laner who was farming for damage items. This meant Tank EKKO was being insanely impactful because he could constantly generate a numbers advantage for his friendly lanes without really having to worry as much about falling behind in relation to his direct opponent. It also translates really well into the late game too, because that early game pressure he could provide would put lanes ahead while he becomes pretty much unkillable with building tank, and at that point teamfights are pretty much unwinnable for enemies because of his sticking potential. Carry EKKO is a really cool way to play him though. It's very interestingly designed, and really it's what Riot wants to see him being played, at least as what we can tell from the changes and from some comments from Riot Gypsy Lore. He mentioned that Carry EKKO's playstyles and gameplay patterns are very healthy in terms of how they're designed, whereas Tank EKKO is a little bit more troublesome. His kit isn't quite assassin tier as full AP, and it's a little bit riskier to play though, but it does give you way more chance to carry if you pull it off. It's better to take Thunderlords or Storm Raider Search for this playstyle because you're so reliant on your mobility and damage. And for which mastery to pick, it seems to be mostly based on where you feel you need the help most. The big pitfall really is that the changes made him more dependent on ability power ratios than base damage, so AP EKKO is weaker early on and needs a little bit more time to scale up. Unfortunately, you cannot force the advantages early in mid lane like you can in the top lane because the lane is shorter and tends to be a host of a lot more early game power. You gotta pick your fights a lot more as AP EKKO for these reasons, and as a result, it's a little bit more difficult to play, and you can't really afford to throw your weight around and risk getting behind because offensive items are just a little bit more expensive. And once again, the assassin style is a lot harder to play, but potentially a lot more fun and rewarding for the skilled players. With the buffs to his ratios, AP EKKO is reasonably strong, and if you survive your laning phase, you have a lot of power to snowball the game, which is something tank EKKO can't necessarily do, at least not with the help of his team. If he gets stacked with enough ability power, you can pretty much just delete people from the game, and your ult becomes a disgustingly strong tool for area of effect damage. It's a little bit hard to line it up to use aggressively though, because the clone is pretty easy to watch out for, but when you do land it, you're getting some crazy damage. This does mean using your escape as a pretty unreliable damage tool though, but that's the risk for the reward you have to aim for when playing carry EKKO, and it's a big part of why his gameplay is very healthy. And Bruiser EKKO in the jungle lies somewhere in between the two. A really long time ago you would actually play tank EKKO in the jungle, but now Bruiser EKKO is definitely the most common jungle build, at least right now. However, this was also nerfed as collateral when the tank EKKO nerfs went through and knocked down his base damage, making things harder for EKKO when it comes to all that important first jungle clear. You can't gank as early as you used to because of this, but it does give you time to stack up the Strength of the Ages mastery, which is pretty crucial to playing Bruiser EKKO, because it offsets your damage item rush with a bit of health as a safety barrier. Using your W properly to gank lanes is the main focus on this build, and you do benefit from slightly stronger shields thanks to the added ability power compared to tank EKKO. A mix of offensive and defensive item builds results in you needing a little bit more gold than tank EKKO, so you really should try to get kills in ganks when you can to make up for the time you lost farming the jungle. Learning when to balance farming and ganking is quite difficult, and it's probably a suboptimal way to play EKKO, so it's equally difficult to assassin EKKO when it comes to pulling it off. Itemizing is pretty simple though. Essentially you just want to rush your damage items like runic echoes and maybe an abyssal scepter while you have high gold income in the early game, and then get your tanky items as you start earning less and less gold in the mid and late game. That pretty much covers the overall playstyles of each role, so let's lay out each style and maybe compare them directly. EKKO's power level during a game depends hugely on his item choices. Cheap defensive items means tank EKKO is by far the most powerful in the relative early game. Rushing tank items has little to no drawback because you can out-trade most people in the top lane thanks to the bonus damage from your passive and the shield from your W proc. Paired with his pretty spammable gap closer, and that means that enemies don't really have much choice about when to fight against EKKO. He can always decide when a trade is going to happen, and this gives him a really good chance to get ahead and control the laning phase. Carry EKKO probably needs a Rod of Ages to get some sustain going, meaning he's quite slow to get going in the game, whereas Bruiser EKKO can get runic echoes quite fast for a reasonably early power spike. In the mid game, the jungle Bruiser EKKO build really shines because his early game damage items, the runic echoes, are a lot cheaper compared to a mid lane AP build. And as the game progresses through, carry EKKO starts to scale super hard and becomes a massive threat. Tank EKKO is still pretty valuable for his frontlining at this point, however Bruiser EKKO does fall off a little bit in the late game, and it's going to take some tricks up your sleeve to find ways to be super useful in teamfights. And once again in teamfights, Bruiser EKKO is kind of the weakest of the three. The problem with being a jack of all trades is that, well, you're a master of none, and he's definitely better suited to finding single targets and picking them off and trying to duke it out with people. Tank EKKO is probably the easiest way to teamfight. You can kind of just damage soak, nibble away at health bars while your team cleans up. You play like the frontline role. Tank EKKO always wants to be in the front line, and a good W stun can pretty much carry a teamfight instantly, especially when you're building tank because you just have so much power to just jump in by yourself. It takes too long to use it as peel though, so it's pretty much always best used to distract or maybe zone the enemy team, or if you can set it up, lock them down. Tank EKKO's ultimate really wants to be used as a survival tool rather than a damage ability, so it's best used to stick in a fight longer or maybe escape after a tower dive. The heal is pretty obnoxious for opponents when you're tanky, especially if you have a Spirit Visage, making it core in most tank EKKO builds alongside a Sunfire Cape and Iceborne Gauntlet. Carry EKKO though really wants to land a good stun on a key target so that he can lock them down and get some burst going. Burst a target out and then escape before he has time to get blown up. So for carry EKKO, it's pretty hard and requires a lot more setup, but deadly powerful, and if you do get it successfully, it carries fights a lot harder. Working around your ultimate is really good here, so you should always aim to get into the middle during a stun to set it up for a follow-up ultimate for a big area of effect damage. Zhonya's is core on Carry EKKO because it lets you do this without needing to make an escape first. And while we're on the topic of items, Iceborne Gauntlet is pretty ridiculous value with Tank EKKO, especially because it turns into just a tower shredder with Sheen procs, so it opens up the opportunity for you to split push. A good split pusher needs to be able to both 1v1 and take towers fast, which forces the enemy team to send a champion or two to deal with you. If you can get back to your team as fast as they shove another lane, this can put you at a serious advantage, and it's one of Tank EKKO's specialties. Carry EKKO can still do this quite well too, picking up a Lichbane rather than maybe a Luden's Echo or a Rabadon's as an alternate damage item. This does give you a little bit less power in teamfights, but in certain games the added single target power seems to really help out, and it's just awesome for split pushing. Bruiser EKKO on the other hand should probably never be building a Sheen item, so he has to stick with his team to be a little bit more useful. So that pretty much covers the core differences between Tank, Carry, and Bruiser EKKO in the top, mid, and jungle. As for which way is the actual best way to play EKKO, it's not entirely sure. I would say Carry EKKO is probably the most fun for me, but it really depends on the situation. This was a pretty fun video to make, but your feedback's going to go a long way, so please let us know what you thought about it in the comments, and it looks like that's going to be it for me. If you guys enjoyed the video, drop a like, subscribe if you want. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.